We made the grave error of underestimating Wallis Simpson, the woman who shattered the royal life of King Edward VIII. Many admired King Edward VIII's sacrifice, praising the love between the two without knowing the dreadful truth behind their ill-fated marriage. The stark reality reveals that he made a disastrous choice, as Wallis Simpson proved to be more sinister than anyone imagined. She single-handedly destroyed Edward VIII's life with her disdain and infidelity behind hidden doors. There are many more disgusting things that Wallis Simpson did to Edward VIII. Let's explore together. Initially, Wallis's bold and unconventional personality had enthralled Edward. Their relationship had always been marked by a dynamic where Wallis took on a dominatrix role while Edward, enamored and eager to please, was submissive. This dynamic may have added a layer of excitement and intensity to their early relationship, but it was unsustainable in the long term. As their marriage progressed, what had once been intriguing and thrilling for Wallis became exasperating and tiresome. With Edward's abdication in 1936, the couple faced a life outside the traditional royal framework. They settled into a life of exile, first in France, and then in various locations across Europe and the United States. Stripped of his royal duties and the adulation of the British public, Edward's world became significantly smaller, revolving almost entirely around Wallis. He was a man who had given up everything for love, but Wallis's feelings were not as enduring as his sacrifice warranted. As the years passed, Wallis began to view her husband with growing disdain. Edward's lack of purpose and direction without his royal responsibilities only seemed to exacerbate Wallis's irritation. She found him dull, his constant presence burdensome, and his attempts to please her inadequate. The former king, once a symbol of charm and sophistication, was now a source of constant annoyance. His habits, such as leaving the dinner table cluttered with his papers, would trigger her wrath. Wallis's treatment of Edward became increasingly harsh and abusive, with observers noting her frequent rants at him over minor transgressions. Wallis's attempts to amuse herself in this increasingly unsatisfying marriage led her to take up a series of outrageous relationships. These relationships were not just a means of seeking personal satisfaction, but seemed designed to humiliate Edward further. Each affair was a blow to the already disgraced Duke, who was struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. The emotional distance between Wallis and Edward grew wider with each passing day. Trust and affection, if they had ever genuinely existed, were now entirely absent from their relationship. Wallis no longer saw Edward as a charming, sophisticated partner, but as an irritating and limited man who could no longer satisfy her needs or desires. What had begun as an intense, albeit unconventional, love affair had deteriorated into a bleak and bitter cohabitation. Edward's health began to decline, and he eventually died in the arms of a nurse, ignored by his estranged wife. Wallis's absence at his deathbed was a poignant symbol of the complete disintegration of their relationship. She had become so detached and disinterested in her husband that she was not present during his final moments. The once captivating and dominant figure in Edward's life had become his emotional and physical abuser, leaving him to die in relative isolation. In 1951, Wallis Simpson underwent a hysterectomy due to ovarian cancer. During her recovery, Edward, Duke of Windsor, demonstrated a profound sense of devotion and care. He visited her every day without fail, always bringing gifts that he thought would bring her comfort and joy, such as red roses and beluga caviar. However, Wallis's response was far from appreciative. She complained that the caviar was too salty and often shooed him away, displaying a marked indifference to his efforts. The change in Wallis's behavior can be traced back to the summer of 1950, a pivotal period in her life. That year, the man she considered the true love of her life married another woman, a blow that profoundly affected her. Although Wallis had achieved the unthinkable by becoming the wife of a former king, she was emotionally devastated by the loss of this man. The abdication had bound her to Edward, making a divorce unthinkable due to the scandal and public outrage it would have caused. Yet, had she been free, Wallis would have married her old friend Herman Rogers without hesitation. Herman Rogers, a wealthy and handsome American, had always been a significant figure in Wallis's life. Their bond was so strong that he even invited the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to accompany him and his second wife on their honeymoon aboard a yacht. This invitation speaks volumes about the closeness of their relationship and the level of comfort Herman felt around Wallis, despite the unconventional nature of the arrangement. However, this trip would soon highlight the emotional turmoil Wallis was experiencing. By the second day of the honeymoon trip, Wallis found herself feeling utterly bereft and despondent. The marriage of her closest companion, coupled with her increasing dissatisfaction with her life alongside Edward, drove her to seek solace elsewhere. This led her to a wild and improbable romance that began when their yacht stopped in Monte Carlo. There, they docked alongside a boat hired by Jimmy Donahue, the heir to the Woolworth fortune. Wallis was already acquainted with Jimmy Donahue's mother and insisted that their party join him for lunch on his boat. Despite Herman's awareness of Jimmy's reputation as an outrageous homosexual and his reservations about the invitation, Wallis was determined. Her insistence can be seen as an attempt to escape her emotional distress and perhaps to reclaim a sense of excitement and novelty in her life. Jimmy Donahue, known for his flamboyant lifestyle and scandalous reputation, represented a stark contrast to the life Wallis was leading with Edward. The lunch aboard Donahue's yacht was not just a social engagement, but an opportunity for Wallis to immerse herself in an environment that was unpredictable and thrilling. Herman's decision to decline the invitation underscores his awareness of the potential for scandal and his protective instincts towards Wallis. Wallis's interactions with Donahue during this period were marked by a desperate attempt to fill the emotional void left by her unfulfilled love for Herman Rogers. Her involvement with Donahue was more than a mere fling. It was an act of rebellion against the constraints of her life as the Duchess of Windsor. It was a way for her to momentarily forget the disappointment and disillusionment she felt toward her marriage and her unachievable desires. For the next 4 years, Wallis Simpson became intensely involved with Jimmy Donahue, a much younger man who captivated her attention and affection. She dedicated nearly all her time to him, immersing herself in a relationship that baffled and scandalized those around her. Jimmy, the heir to the Woolworth fortune, reciprocated Wallis's attentions with extravagant gifts and gestures of affection. He lavished her with magnificent jewels, including a stunning sapphire ring, luxurious furs, and an abundance of flowers. Donahue spared no expense, chartering yachts and penning billets doux, love letters, that conveyed his unwavering devotion to Wallis. Their relationship was conspicuously public, drawing the attention and bewilderment of high society. Even the most sophisticated circles found themselves taken aback by the intensity and openness of Wallis and Jimmy's bond. Many observers speculated that Wallis had lost her senses, driven to madness by her obsession with the much younger man. Those who knew her best perceived Jimmy as a rebound, a way for Wallis to fill the void left by Herman Rogers, who remained painfully out of reach. The impact of this relationship on Wallis's behavior and personality was stark. Lady Gladwin, an acquaintance of the Windsors, recounted how Wallis underwent a troubling transformation during this period. According to Lady Gladwin, Wallis became rude, odious, and strange, a shadow of her former self. The once poised and controlled Duchess of Windsor now appeared erratic and unhinged. Lady Gladwin noted that Wallis seemed either drugged or drunk, her demeanor reflecting a descent into a chaotic and reckless lifestyle. Wallis's choice of companions and activities further illustrated her drastic change. She surrounded herself with effeminate young men, spending nights in exclusive nightclubs and engaging in a hedonistic lifestyle. This newfound social circle and nocturnal routine were a sharp departure from her previous image. Wallis's behavior became so outlandish that she would often send the Duke of Windsor home early from their outings, dismissing him with a dismissive, "Buzz off, mosquito." Such a flippant and disrespectful way of addressing Edward, the once King of England, underscored the extent of her alienation from him. The beginning of Wallis Simpson's involvement with Jimmy Donahue not only signaled a cooling off in her relationship with Herman Rogers, but also marked a significant shift in her treatment of Edward, the Duke of Windsor. Known for her biting sarcasm and sharp wit, Wallis had always maintained a degree of verbal sparring with Edward, often using her outsider status to assert herself. Phrases like, "I wasn't castle-born like you," were common retorts, subtly reminding Edward of her different background, and perhaps hinting at a perceived superiority in her understanding of the world outside royal circles. However, with the advent of her affair with Jimmy Donahue, Wallis's demeanor toward Edward took on a more pronounced cruelty. According to reports and observations from those around them, Wallis's remarks became sharper, more cutting, and at times outright cruel. She would reportedly make remarks that left Edward emotionally wounded, such as his abject refrain of, "Will I be going to bed in tears tonight?" when she was particularly unpleasant. This change in behavior hinted at a deeper emotional turmoil within Wallis, perhaps exacerbated by her unfulfilled desires and frustrations with her marriage. Despite the apparent distress caused by Wallis's words, Edward seemed to derive a peculiar satisfaction from this dynamic. Ulick Alexander, a veteran courtier who observed the couple closely, noted that the former king appeared to take pleasure in the perversion of self-abasement. This observation sheds light on the complex dynamics at play within their relationship, a mixture of power dynamics, emotional entanglement, and perhaps a mutual understanding of their roles. For Edward, who had abdicated the throne for the woman he loved, this could be interpreted as a form of penance or devotion, where enduring Wallis's verbal barbs was a demonstration of his unwavering commitment to her. It also reflected Edward's own complicated relationship with power and identity post-abdication, where he struggled to find purpose and fulfillment outside the monarchy. Jimmy Donahue's presence in the lives of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor marked a notable departure from their usual social circles. Known for his flamboyance and penchant for extravagance, Donahue injected a new energy into their world, often joining them for dinners, late-night cabarets, and parties across Europe and America. His presence was not just tolerated, but embraced, especially by the Duke, who had a reputation for being frugal. Donahue's willingness to foot the bill for their social escapades added to his allure, earning him favor in the eyes of the Windsor couple. Despite his inclusion in their inner circle, Donahue's lifestyle and behavior occasionally clashed with the Duke's more conservative views. The Duke, known for his disdain toward homosexuality, found himself in arguments with Wallis over their gay friends. On one occasion, when tensions ran high, Wallis famously retorted to the Duke, "You should listen to them. They are much brighter than you," highlighting her exasperation with his narrow-mindedness. Unlike other gay men in the Windsor social circle who were discreet, Donahue reveled in shocking people. His penchant for nudity during social gatherings became a notorious party trick. It was not uncommon for him to strip naked during dinner parties, much to the astonishment and, perhaps, discomfort of their guests. This behavior was a testament to Donahue's flamboyant personality and his disregard for conventional social norms. In America, Donahue's Long Island home became a notorious hotspot for wild parties, often filled with boys and young men. These gatherings were known for their excesses, where guests would indulge in alcohol and revelry. Donahue's personal quarters in the basement were designed to reflect his eccentric tastes, decorated entirely in black or red. His interior designer friend, Billy Baldwin, recalled Donahue's directive, All I want to be able to see is their teeth and their eyeballs, suggesting a penchant for dramatic and theatrical settings. The relationship between Wallis Simpson and Jimmy Donahue was one of mutual admiration and indulgence. While the Duke and Duchess were accustomed to attending elegant soirees and events at Donahue's homes, which were often graced with full dance orchestras and opulent decor, there was a playful undercurrent to their interactions. On one memorable occasion, Donahue amused himself by giving the Windsors a tour of his basement rooms without disclosing their more scandalous late-night purposes, an act that underscored his mischievous sense of humor and the Windsors' unwitting participation in his private joke. Despite the unconventional nature of their friendship, Wallis held Donahue in high regard. His tastes and opinions were respected to such an extent that he became the first male outsider invited to inspect an 18th-century mill house near Paris that the Windsors purchased in 1952. This gesture raised eyebrows among their circle, fueling speculation about the depth of their relationship and Wallis's growing reliance on Donahue's companionship. The autumn of 1950 marked a significant period in Wallis's association with Donahue. While the Duke was occupied in France with his autobiography, Wallis found herself in New York, reveling in nightly escapades with Donahue, who was nearly 2 decades her junior. For Wallis, Donahue represented a vivacious contrast to her husband's suffocating presence, a reminder of her youth and vitality in contrast to the Duke's more sedate demeanor. Jimmy Donahue embodied a flamboyant and openly gay lifestyle, which added a dynamic dimension to Windsor's social circle. His presence offered Wallis not only a reprieve from the pressures of her role, but also a partner in the arduous task of entertaining the Duke, who often demanded attention and admiration. Reflecting on her life with the Duke, Wallis once remarked, "You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance," a sentiment that encapsulated the complexities of her relationship with Edward and the relief she found in Donahue's company. In the early 1950s, Wallis Simpson's relationship with Jimmy Donahue blossomed into a public spectacle that captivated and scandalized the social circles of New York and beyond. Their frequent outings to restaurants and nightclubs, where they were often seen giggling and whispering, sparked widespread speculation about the true nature of their intimacy. While some observers suggested they were lovers, others viewed their relationship as a deep companionship founded on mutual wit and shared interests. Interior designer Nicholas Haslam, who knew Jimmy Donahue well, provided a skeptical perspective on the rumors of a romantic involvement between Donahue and Wallis. Haslam remarked that Donahue, known for his flamboyance and his preference for male companionship, seemed unlikely to have been physically intimate with any woman, particularly someone as notoriously strong-willed and formidable as Wallis Simpson. Meanwhile, Wallis's estranged husband, the Duke of Windsor, grew increasingly alarmed by the tabloid reports detailing his wife's escapades with Donahue. These stories, regularly splashed across the pages of the New York press, depicted Wallis and Jimmy as inseparable, often whispering and passing notes to each other in public places. The Duke, distressed by the public scrutiny and feeling sidelined by his wife's burgeoning relationship, became desperate to reclaim her attention. In a dramatic gesture, the Duke rushed to join Wallis in America, spurred on by a sense of urgency related to geopolitical tensions of the Cold War era. He allegedly told his ghostwriter that he needed to be in America because of a perceived Soviet threat to Europe, an excuse that highlighted his emotional turmoil and need to assert his presence in Wallis's life. Shortly before his arrival, a tabloid rumor circulated that their marriage was on the rocks, described as puffed in sensational terms. Upon his arrival in America, the Duke orchestrated a well-publicized reunion with Wallis at a dockside, embracing her multiple times to dispel rumors of marital discord. This public display temporarily quelled speculation about their relationship, but did little to assuage the Duke's growing anxiety over Wallis's closeness to Donahue. Despite the brief respite, Wallis and Jimmy resumed their social activities with unabated enthusiasm, leaving the Duke increasingly isolated. He accompanied them to nightclubs and restaurants, but found himself increasingly marginalized in their company. Wallis, focused on her newfound friendship with Donahue, often sent the Duke home early so she could continue reveling with her younger companion. Wallis, known for her sharp wit and acerbic tongue, engaged in lovers' tiffs with Jimmy that amused and scandalized their social circles. During one heated argument, Wallis famously exclaimed, "And to think I gave up a king for a queen," a biting remark that underscored her frustration and perhaps hinted at lingering regrets over her pivotal role in Edward VIII's abdication. The Duke of Windsor, on the sidelines of Wallis's increasingly public life with Jimmy Donahue, grew increasingly concerned about the implications of their close friendship. Aware of the gossip and scandal surrounding Wallis's nightly outings with Jimmy, the Duke confronted her about the impropriety of seeing the same single man every night, regardless of her title. His admonishment, captured by his secretary, highlighted his deep-seated unease and possessiveness over Wallis, driven not by her status as the Duchess of Windsor, but by his role as her husband. "Any man would mind his wife doing this," he asserted, seeking to reclaim authority over a relationship that had spiraled beyond his control. In the early 1950s, Wallis Simpson and Jimmy Donahue's unconventional relationship reached a climax on New Year's Eve of 1953, marking a peculiar and highly publicized moment in their lives. Donahue, known for his flamboyance and penchant for spectacle, orchestrated a mock coronation for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor at El Morocco, a popular Manhattan nightclub frequented by New York's elite. The event was a blend of irreverence and irony, capturing the attention of the press and public alike. Donahue, with characteristic flair, adorned the Duke and Duchess with elaborate paper crowns, symbolically recreating a coronation, the pinnacle of royal pomp and circumstance. For Wallis, who had famously sought to be the queen beside Edward VIII, it was a moment tinged with both mockery and longing, a stark contrast to the grandeur she had once aspired to. The nightclub, typically a venue for lively parties and social gatherings, became an arena of spectacle on New Year's Eve. Surrounded by a crowd of cocktail-drinking revelers, the Duke and Duchess, now removed from their royal roles and residing in the social milieu of New York City, were thrust into an unfamiliar spotlight. Photographers captured their self-conscious embarrassment, juxtaposing the remnants of royal dignity with the realities of their unconventional post-abdication life. Bill Nichols, among the few English witnesses to this audacious scene, reflected on the spectacle with a mix of disbelief and criticism. He remarked, "One didn't know whether to be more surprised at the awesome insensitivity of the Duchess or the awful weakness of the Duke." Nichols' observation underscored the broader sentiment that surrounded the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in their post-abdication years, a blend of fascination, disapproval, and morbid curiosity about their lives beyond the throne. In the aftermath of their tumultuous relationship, Jimmy Donahue and Wallis Simpson found themselves at odds, their once close bond marred by irreconcilable differences and Donahue's increasingly erratic behavior. As with many love affairs, what began as a whirlwind of passion and mutual admiration eventually soured under the weight of petty grievances and personal conflicts. Donahue's charm, once irresistible to Wallis, began to fray at the edges. His habitual tardiness, initially a minor annoyance, grew into a significant source of frustration for the Duchess, highlighting their diverging priorities and expectations. Beyond mere punctuality, Donahue's behavior took a darker turn, revealing a penchant for cruel and violent outbursts that shook the foundations of their relationship. The incident at the spa in Baden-Baden in August 1954 epitomized the deterioration of their affair. During a seemingly mundane meal, tensions escalated when Wallis, in a moment of irritation, commented on Donahue's garlic breath. In response, he lashed out with a forceful kick under the table, causing her to bleed and prompting the Duke to intervene. This act of physical aggression, crossed a line for the Duke, who had tolerated much from Donahue, but could not abide such disrespect towards his wife. In a moment of red-faced fury, the Duke, known for his temperance and discretion, confronted Donahue bluntly. "We've had enough of you. Get out!" This decisive expulsion marked the definitive end of Donahue's association with the Windsors. His flippant response to inquiries about the rift, "I've abdicated," reflected his irreverent attitude and underscored the irreparable nature of their relationship's breakdown. For Wallis, the departure of Donahue did not provoke deep anguish or remorse. Instead, she swiftly shifted her focus to her next endeavor, writing her autobiography. The process, however, was not without its challenges. The initial ghostwriter, tasked with capturing Wallis's life story, soon encountered the Duchess's mercurial nature and tendency to embellish or alter facts at her whim. This penchant for narrative manipulation hints at Wallis's complex relationship with truth and her desire to control her public image even in the realm of autobiography. The fallout with Donahue marked a turning point for Wallis, prompting her to reevaluate her priorities and the company she kept. While her relationship with Edward had weathered numerous storms, Donahue's departure underscored the fleeting nature of alliances formed in the fast-paced world of socialite circles. Despite the public scrutiny and occasional scandal that followed her, Wallis remained resolute in maintaining a semblance of dignity and control over her own narrative. The dynamic between the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, post-abdication, revealed a complex and often troubled relationship that was scrutinized by those within their inner circle and observers from afar. Cleveland Amory, a Boston-born writer, spent an extended period with the Windsors, documenting their lives and interactions with friends. His observations painted a stark picture of the Duchess's treatment of her husband, Edward. Amory was particularly struck by the casual cruelty Wallis Simpson directed towards the Duke. According to Amory and his stepdaughter, Dr. Gaia Lionheart, Wallis could be gratuitously vicious, leaving Edward emotionally wounded on multiple occasions. Small acts of exclusion, like allowing her own pug dogs into their shared spaces while barring Edward's dogs, were symbolic of a larger pattern of emotional neglect and manipulation. Moreover, Wallis exhibited disdain for Edward's quirks and mannerisms that diverged from her expectations. She reportedly grew furious when Edward engaged in behaviors she deemed beneath his station, such as humming advertising jingles or using American colloquialisms. These reactions reflected Wallis's desire to maintain a certain image and social decorum, even in private settings with her husband. To those close to the Windsors, Edward's demeanor appeared increasingly downtrodden and submissive. Amory's stepdaughter described him as lacking brightness and viewed him as a pitiable figure who regretted his life choices profoundly. She characterized him as a wimp and someone who lived with the consequences of a monumental mistake, his abdication of the throne for love. The daily rituals within their household underscored the power dynamics at play. Each morning, Edward dutifully appeared in Wallis's quarters at precisely 11:30 a.m., ready to receive his instructions for the day. His obedience was unwavering. Whenever Wallis summoned him, he responded promptly, even leaving a barber in the midst of attending to him to attend to her needs. This devotion, despite her mistreatment, highlighted Edward's enduring consideration for his wife's demands. Lady Alexandra Metcalfe, a confidant who witnessed their interactions firsthand, remarked on Edward's role as being akin to a child under Wallis's control. Despite his title and former status, he was subject to her whims and demands, a sentiment echoed by many who observed their relationship closely. Metcalfe expressed sympathy for Edward, describing him as a poor little man who endured immense suffering under Wallis's domineering influence. Edward's protective gestures towards Wallis, such as ensuring she handled only new banknotes due to his aversion to the old currency, further illustrated his enduring care for her well-being despite their strained relationship. These gestures, however, did little to alleviate the pervasive sense of imbalance and control within their marriage, where Wallis held significant sway over Edward's actions and emotions. Despite the passage of time and the significant shifts in global politics, the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, retained some deeply troubling beliefs and sympathies. His anti-Semitism and admiration for Adolf Hitler, which had been whispered about for years, were shockingly confirmed through various accounts. Dr. Gaia Lionheart, Cleveland Amory's stepdaughter, recalled the horrifying dinner-table conversations where the Duke and Duchess openly expressed their belief that the world would be better off if Jews were exterminated. This sentiment was not an isolated incident, but a recurring theme in their discussions, revealing a dark and persistent ideology. One particularly chilling incident occurred at a dinner party where the Duke unabashedly stated, "I have never thought Hitler was such a bad chap." This statement alone would have been enough to unsettle most guests, but he went further. In a grotesque demonstration, he intertwined his fingers with those of a lady guest, using the gesture to illustrate his view that Jews had their tentacles wrapped around German society. All Hitler was trying to do was free the tentacles, he said, oblivious to the horror and silence that descended over the table. The appalling nature of this view was too much for Milton Berle, a New York advertising executive, who bravely confronted the Duke. "Sir," he said, "I never believed I would ever hear at a civilized dinner table a defense of Adolf Hitler." The Duke, momentarily embarrassed, blushed, but did not retract his statement. Cleveland Amory, who spent 6 months interviewing the Duke and Duchess and their acquaintances, was appalled by these revelations. He discovered that Wallis Simpson, the Duchess, was not only complicit in these views, but also prone to deceit whenever it suited her. Her first ghostwriter had abandoned the project, frustrated by her constant fabrications. Amory found himself navigating a web of lies and had to rely heavily on interviews with the Windsors' friends to piece together a more accurate account of their lives. His handwritten observations detailing these disturbing conversations and Wallis's manipulative nature remained unpublished until recently, shedding new light on the true characters of the Duke and Duchess. The Duke's admiration for Hitler and his persistent anti-Semitism were not mere youthful indiscretions, but deeply ingrained beliefs that persisted well into his later years. These views were not only abhorrent, but also dangerously out of step with the evolving world around him. While the Duke and Duchess continued to live in relative comfort and privilege, their dinner-table conversations revealed a profound moral failing that tarnished their legacy. Cleveland Amory's extensive interviews for his work on Wallis Simpson and the Duke of Windsor led him to several significant individuals, including Herman Rogers and his second wife, Lucy. The relationship between Wallis and Herman was a poignant thread in the tapestry of her life, marked by deep affection, unfulfilled longing, and eventual estrangement. After Herman remarried Lucy, Wallis attempted to rekindle their friendship, perhaps motivated by nostalgia or lingering feelings of loss. Despite Wallis's efforts to mend the rift, inviting Herman and Lucy to stay at the Windsors' Mill House near Paris, the couple declined. This rejection symbolized the deep hurt and betrayal felt by Herman, who had been a steadfast friend and confidant to Wallis for many years. Herman's battle with Parkinson's disease and his eventual death in 1957 further complicated the emotional landscape. He passed away in Lucy's arms, a testament to the enduring love and support within their marriage, contrasting starkly with the tumultuous and often toxic relationship between Wallis and the Duke. The Windsors' response to Herman's death was nothing short of callous. Neither Wallis nor the Duke attended his funeral, nor did they send flowers or any form of condolence that would signify genuine sorrow or respect. Instead, Wallis sent Lucy a telegram, which, instead of offering solace, contained a glaringly self-centered message. all my love and sympathy over my loss. This phrase, which could be dismissed as a mere error, was perceived by Lucy as a deliberate and cruel oversight. The telegram's wording underscored Wallis's capacity for insensitivity and her relentless self-absorption. Lucy, deeply hurt and angered by the telegram, nevertheless chose to accept future invitations from Wallis to visit the mill house. This acceptance was not born out of a desire to forgive or forget, but rather from a complex mix of emotions, including the need for closure and perhaps a touch of schadenfreude. Visiting Wallis, Lucy could now hold a unique position of power, subtly reminding the Duchess of Hermon's legacy and the deep bond they once shared. These visits allowed Lucy to assert her own narrative and maintain a connection to Hermon's memory, even if it was within the realm of a strained and complicated relationship with Wallis. Herman Rogers had been more than just a friend to Wallis. He was a symbol of the life she could have had if not for the whirlwind romance and subsequent marriage to Edward VIII. Herman's steadiness, kindness, and enduring love represented a stark contrast to the volatile and often degrading dynamics she experienced with the Duke. The knowledge that Herman had died in the arms of a loving wife only accentuated the emptiness and dysfunction in her own marriage. Wallis's attempt to renew ties with Lucy after Herman's death was likely driven by a mixture of guilt, nostalgia, and a need to maintain connections to her past. However, the lack of genuine empathy and the apparent selfishness in her telegram revealed her inability to truly reconcile with her actions or understand the depth of hurt she had caused. Lucy's decision to interact with Wallis on her terms, accepting invitations but never forgetting the slight, showcased her resilience and determination to honor Herman's memory in her own way. By the 1960s, the once notorious Duke and Duchess of Windsor had become emblematic of faded glamour and lingering scandal. They were widely perceived as a couple simply marking time, their lives a series of aimless social engagements and repetitive routines. Their days were structured to the point of rigidity, highlighting the emptiness of their existence. Their daily schedule began with an 11:30 a.m. meeting, a ritualistic interaction that underscored the Duke's subservience to Wallis. This meeting was more than a check-in. It was a stark reminder of the Duchess's control over her husband. Following this, Wallis would lunch with friends, a social engagement that allowed her to bask in the attention and admiration she still craved. Meanwhile, the Duke retreated to the golf course, a solitary pursuit that symbolized his increasing isolation. As evening approached, the Duke indulged in his nightly ritual of consuming a bottle of 25-year-old malt whiskey. This habit was less about enjoyment and more about numbing the disappointment and regret that had come to define his life. Wallis, on the other hand, would attend to her appearance with a standing 7:30 p.m. appointment with her hairdresser. These appointments were not just about maintaining her looks, but also about asserting control over one of the few aspects of her life that remained within her grasp. Their social life revolved around dinner parties, held punctually at 9 p.m. These gatherings were once the highlight of their day, but by the 60s, they had become tedious obligations. Guests dreaded being seated next to the Duke, whose conversation had become increasingly dull and predictable. The charm and wit that once captivated a nation had long since faded, replaced by repetitive anecdotes and a palpable sense of ennui. In restaurants, the Duchess was acutely aware of appearances. If their conversation lagged, she would insist that they recite the alphabet to one another. This bizarre practice was not about maintaining conversation, but about creating the illusion of lively interaction for the benefit of other diners. It was a desperate attempt to cling to the vestiges of their once glamorous public image, a facade that was increasingly irrelevant to a world that had moved on. The international social scene of the 1960s had new idols, dynamic figures like Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, whose tumultuous romance captivated the public imagination. Aristotle Onassis and Jacqueline Kennedy also emerged as icons of a new era, their wealth and influence far outshining the Windsors' faded glory. These new darlings of society embodied the excitement and change of the times, leaving the Duke and Duchess as relics of a bygone era. The Duchess's relentless pursuit of social validation and her efforts to maintain their public image became increasingly futile. The world no longer cared about their scandalous past or their attempts to remain relevant. The Duke's abdication, once a seismic event, had receded into history, overshadowed by the evolving dramas and scandals of a new generation. Wallis's interactions with her social circle revealed her deep-seated need for control and recognition. Her lunches with friends were more than social outings. They were stages on which she could perform and assert her dominance. The Duke's retreat to the golf course symbolized his resignation and detachment from the social world that still captivated his wife. In 1972, the Duke of Windsor, once King Edward VIII, was a shadow of his former self. At 78 years old, he was battling throat cancer, a struggle that left him frail and vulnerable. Amidst his declining health, he received a notable visit from Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip during their official visit to France. This visit was steeped in a poignant irony, for it underscored both the enduring significance of his royal lineage and the irrevocable consequences of his abdication. The Duke, despite his mortal illness, could not resist raising one final request, the possibility of Wallis Simpson being granted the appellation Her Royal Highness. It was a testament to his lifelong quest to secure for Wallis the royal recognition she had been denied since their marriage. Yet, as it had been for decades, his request was denied, reinforcing the unyielding stance of the monarchy on this matter. In his final days, the Duke was cared for by Julie Alexander, a spirited 26-year-old nurse from Baltimore. Her presence was a rare comfort in his last, lonely chapter. Despite his ill health, Edward had a discerning eye for his caregivers and had dismissed several nurses before Julie. Her Baltimore roots likely endeared her to him, connecting her in his mind to Wallis's own origins. Julie undertook the demanding task of caring for the Duke, working 12-hour night shifts at his residence in the Bois de Boulogne, Paris. Her dedication was perhaps one of the few sources of solace for Edward as he faced the end of his life. The Duke's evenings were marked by a profound solitude. Apart from Julie and his beloved pug dog, Black Diamond, he had little companionship. His evenings were starkly isolated, a sharp contrast to the vibrant social life he had once known. The solitude was intensified by the absence of Wallis, whose quarters were on the same floor of their home, but separated by what she referred to as the boudoir. This physical separation mirrored the emotional and relational distance that had grown between them over the years. Julie Alexander, the nurse who tended to the ailing Duke of Windsor in his final days, had a front-row seat to the tragic end of a once great love story. She recalled with a heavy heart how Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, remained conspicuously absent from her husband's side. She never came to see him or kiss him goodnight or see how he was, not once, Julie lamented. The Duke, a man who had given up the throne for love, spent his last days calling out for the woman he had sacrificed everything for. Wallis, 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 or darling, 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 he would cry, his voice filled with a longing that was as pitiful as it was heartbreaking. It was pitiful and pathetic, just so sad, like a lamb calling for its mother, Julie remembered. One night, as his breathing grew labored and the end seemed near, Julie cradled the Duke in her arms, offering what comfort she could. At 2:20 a.m. on Sunday, May 28, 1972, the man who had once been king and emperor passed away in the arms of a woman from Baltimore. Right city, wrong woman, Julie mused, highlighting the cruel twist of fate that saw the Duke die in the arms of a stranger rather than the wife he so desperately loved. Thus ended the royal romance of the century, a love story that had once captivated the world and altered the course of British history. After a doctor pronounced the Duke dead, Wallis was finally woken. She sat with her late husband's body, holding his hand and whispering sweet nothings. There were no tears, no cries of anguish, just a quiet, detached farewell. It was a stark contrast to the passionate, turbulent relationship they had once shared. In the months following Edward's burial in the grounds of Windsor Castle, Wallis began to show signs of forgetfulness, and her descent into dementia was swift. For years, she lingered on, becoming progressively more physically and mentally debilitated. Her once grand home became a living tomb, populated only by a revolving door of hired nurses. Wallis Simpson died on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89. Despite the contentious relationship she had with the royal family and her disdain for England, she was allowed to rest beside her husband on the grounds of Windsor Castle. Her funeral service, held at St. George's Chapel and attended by members of the royal family, offered a final nod to the Duke's wishes. Her coffin was carried by 8 soldiers from one of the Duke's former regiments, the Welsh Guards, a detail that would have pleased Edward. Yet there was a bitter irony in Wallis's final resting place. In death, she found herself lying next to a man she had barely tolerated in the private cemetery of a family she had loathed, covered by the earth of a country she had hated. The once vivacious socialite, who had lived life on her own terms, ended up ensnared in the very conventions she had spent her life defying. Her decline into dementia robbed her of the sharp wit and fierce independence that had defined her, leaving behind a frail, forgotten woman. The Duke's death marked the end of an era. His abdication had forever altered the British monarchy, and his marriage to Wallis had been a symbol of defiance and romance. But in his final days, the grandeur of their love story had faded, replaced by isolation and regret. The Duke, who had once commanded the world stage, died in relative obscurity, his last moments marked by a desperate yearning for the wife who had remained aloof. What do you think about Edward VIII's ruined life at the hands of Wallis Simpson? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.